Hello. I'd like to talk to Americans about democracy. And I mean real democracy, as opposed to what we have right now. I say that because you're led to believe that the divisive partisan contest for power and the absurd political theater you see on television is democracy in action. But I disagree. Just consider what the dictionary definition of democracy is. It's government by the people, a form of government in which power is vested in the people and exercised directly by the people or by their political representatives. But the meaning is very clear because democracy is qualified as that which creates equality of rights and privileges, social equality, and a democratic spirit in which the common people hold the political power. Now, that definition does not describe the U.S. government. Now, granted, Americans are still allowed to vote, but the whole electoral process has become deeply flawed, terribly unfair, and rigged to favor the rich. And even though politicians who are elected are supposed to represent all the people in their constituency, most do not. As it is now, regardless of their party, most politicians serve the interests of those among the wealthiest few who fund their campaigns and wield the real power that pulls the strings. That's part of the reason why America does not have government that is of the people, by the people, or for the people. Instead, what we have is government of, by, and for the rich. And that's called plutocracy, not democracy. But I'll go even further and submit that what America really has is a presidential form of monarchy, though it is actually controlled by plutocrats. It is meant to appear as a democracy, but the divisive, polarizing, partisan contest for the throne invalidates it. And the fact is that the person who wins the throne is elected by only about half of the eligible voters who bother to vote. And usually, 40% of the eligible voters don't even bother to vote. So the reality is that an American president is elected by a small percentage of the American people. But wait, that's not even the worst part. The partisan political contest for the throne perpetuates conflict and division, and it leads to corruption, slander, cheating, and other wrongdoing. It even leads to distorted interpretations of the Constitution. Interpretations that are designed to justify and legalize the political actions of extremely rich people who believe they are entitled to rule. Now, the things that I've mentioned are just some of the problems that politicians simply ignore. It seems they like the way things are because they lead Americans to believe that their campaigns and elections are fair and square, and that they fulfill the will of the people. But the people, you and I, and the vast majority, know that's simply not true. Now, of course, all political candidates say what is politically expedient because they are keenly aware of what people want to hear. But what they say is usually token rhetoric or unrealistic promises. That's why today, in spite of all the promises made by Democrats in 2008 to make changes and establish reforms and justice, the rich are now richer than ever before, and their banks and corporations are more profitable than ever before, while the rest of us keep falling further and further into financial insecurity, and growing numbers of us suffer the consequences of poverty. And the fact is that our situation would be even worse under a Republican president, in spite of what the Republican propaganda machine keeps churning out to mislead people. But Republicans are not the only problem. Most politicians, regardless of their party, go along to get along. And they continue to perpetuate a rigged system that makes them and their financial backers richer. Consequently, politicians do not serve the interests of more than half of the American people who are barely scraping by and are seriously at risk of disastrous financial difficulties. And politicians have done little or nothing about the fact that America has the highest child poverty rate of all the industrialized countries in the world. So, these are just some of the reasons why we, the people, need to examine how, when, and why things went so wrong in America politically. Because in my view, it was early on, during, and especially after the first American presidency. Now, I really should elaborate and clarify that while I criticize greedy rich people, I should also say that there's nothing wrong with being rich, if and when the rich person deserves great reward for their hard works, their good works, and for their skills and talents. However, greed and selfishness are still wrong. And I rebuke the forces of greed and self-interest who enjoy ill-gotten gains and unjust profits and use their wealth to gain political power. I should also sum up the basic partisan political division, because Republicans still believe that laws and legislation should benefit the wealthy. And that's not just because they think that they are entitled to power and privilege. It's also because they claim, as Ronald Reagan claimed, that wealth will naturally trickle down and benefit everyone. And even though that's been proven false in the last 3 decades, since the middle class keeps shrinking and the working poor population keeps growing, Reaganites still insist it's true. Fortunately, on the other side of the political aisle, there are a few ethical and honest New Deal Democrats left who still believe that legislation should enable the vast majority to become prosperous, because widespread prosperity will benefit all the people and the whole country in many ways. The facts, the historical facts, show very clearly which political ideology serves the best interests of the people and the country. But in spite of the facts, the power of money has enabled the forces of greed and self-interest to fool many gullible Americans and convince them that the Reaganite way of governance is both patriotic and religious, as they claim, even though it actually violates the intent of America's founders and actually turns Christianity upside down. And they claim that what's good for business is good for everyone, even though the truth is that what's best for business is what's best for everyone. But the worst thing about it is that during the last 3 decades, since Republicans have become increasingly more extreme in their right-wing views, Democrats, especially since the 1990s, have done what's politically expedient, and they have moved further and further towards the right, due to the popularity of Ronald Reagan. But in doing so, Democrats have helped to perpetuate Reaganism and trickle-down Reaganomics, which Reaganites like to call supply-side economics. But that's why today both Democrats and Republicans cater to and serve the interests of the wealthiest few and their banks and corporations. But even so, Republicans are still more zealous and more blatant in advocating for the wealthiest few, and they fight unreasonably and unfairly to give the rich and their banks and corporations free rein and special privileges. Now, to wind this up, I'll just say that the articles I have written discuss all these issues thoroughly. You can read them, as well as the text of this address, on the website I will give you. And what will follow on the screen will be internet addresses to those articles. I hope you will consider what I have said, and I hope you will consider what I have written. For the sake of real democracy, and for the sake of our liberty. It's in your hands. Thanks for listening.